Greetings and welcome to Fast Thinking. My name is Haris Samad and I am Assistant Director here at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. Following the Taliban's takeover of Kabul on the 15th of August, the Afghan people are confronted with the reality of renewed Taliban rule, and international leaders are scrambling to figure out how to respond. Meanwhile, within the region, Afghanistan's stability represents a significant national security concern for South Asia's two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, with implications for politics and security in both countries. So, on this episode of Fast Thinking, we're asking, what does Taliban rule in Afghanistan mean for India and Pakistan? We're joined by Director of the South Asia Center and Professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, Irfan Nooruddin. Irfan, to start us off, I'd like to touch on the regional dynamics at play here. Now, it's no secret that India and Pakistan have sometimes outsourced their rivalry to regional conflicts, but what is unique about these particular developments and their implications for Islamabad and Delhi? How will it affect India and Pakistan's threat perceptions of each other and thus influence their behavior?
That's a great question, Harris, and good to see you. Look, the threat perceptions of these two countries, unfortunately, is as high as it has been, right? All the confidence building measures of a decade ago have gone away. India and Pakistan, once again, indulging in very heavy, heated rhetoric about each other. So I say that almost tongue-in-cheek to say, in some sense, this is kind of irrelevant because the relationship has not been very good for a while. And what happens over here can't hardly make it much worse. And yet, I fear that what will happen, and the most direct implication of this, is really to trigger memories of the bad old days from the 1990s, when the insurgency, for instance, in Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, as the Pakistanis would call it, or as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, as the Indians might refer to it, really heated up, largely fueled by mujahideen who had cut their teeth fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. You might remember that Osama bin Laden and much of his Taliban forces and al-Qaeda forces fought in Kashmir as well as in Afghanistan. So from India's perspective, this cannot be good news. This is the fall of a government to which it had been quite supportive, both in Hamid Karzai's time as well as in Ashraf Ghani's time. India had a very significant humanitarian presence in Afghanistan, was doing a lot of infrastructure projects. So a return of the Taliban means that India no longer has a partner in Afghanistan with which it can work, and possibly also a return to the bad days. For Pakistan, and we'll spend some time talking about Pakistan, I imagine, right? For Pakistan, this is complicated. On the one hand, there's no question that many see them as the most immediate beneficiary of the return of the Taliban in Kabul, and yet you can't help but think that Islamabad wonders whether it has bitten off more than it can chew.
Should the Taliban allow other militant groups to operate out of Afghanistan, regional countries such as India and Pakistan, as well as Iran and Central Asia, will feel these effects most immediately. Might the region be able to align behind a shared vision of counterterrorism in Afghanistan that pressures the Taliban to refuse sanctuary and/or sponsorship for any such groups?
Well, let's take those two questions separately. So the first is, there's no question that the big concern for all of the regional countries, and here especially maybe Pakistan, is whether or not other extremist groups take refuge in Afghanistan, much as they did back in the 1990s, and use that safe haven as a base from which to cause havoc all around the world. On the one hand, of course, in America, we think most poignantly of 9/11 and the attacks then, and maybe even of some other attacks that occurred in the 1990s that were fueled by al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But Pakistanis would be quick to remind you that more Pakistanis died at the hands of these terrorists than any other country in the world. And so the vision of insurgent groups operating freely across the border cannot be very good for Pakistani planners. This is also true in Central Asia, this is true in China, this is true in Iran, this is true, as you said, throughout the region. Can they align? Well, here I think my cynicism outweighs my optimism on this. There needs to be some real intel sharing and coordination, but we are talking about countries that barely have cordial bilateral relations on any dimension, let alone on things that are as sensitive as this, and where trust is so minimal. Is there anything the Pakistani government can assure India it's doing on counterterrorism that Delhi is going to believe, and vice versa? And so I think what we're going to need really is a third-party actor, the United States perhaps, NATO and the United Kingdom, that really plays the role in saying, listen, this is the situation, the Taliban is back. What we cannot allow them to do is become a safe haven for terrorists around the world. Let's get our act together. Let's figure out how we talk to each other to keep the counterterrorism at the top of the agenda. But without that, I don't see the regional players being able to do it for themselves.
The rollback of fundamental human rights, religious freedom, independent media, and the growth of the strongman government have only accelerated during COVID-19 in South Asia. What are the broader implications of Taliban rule as an extremist-led religious autocracy on human rights, and in particular on women and girls' livelihoods across the region?
Well, I mean, it's hard to overstate how depressing the scenario is, right? The notion that after 20 years of hard-fought gains by women and girls in Afghanistan, right, some of the most amazing and inspirational leaders in government and civil society in Afghanistan are the women who have been able to exercise freedoms that were unimaginable under Taliban rule. And to think about the trauma being caused to them by the reality of the return of the Taliban is really heartbreaking. In the region as a whole, I mean, the implications for women and girls is probably quite limited in countries where, radical elements anyway constrain women and girls. That will continue unabated. But I don't see that being a direct spillover effect. But the bigger issue is whether or not the United States and the European countries that have long been, at least rhetorically, the champions of democracy and human rights lose credibility because of what is seen as an abandoning of Afghanistan and of Afghanistan's women and girls to the Taliban. It is one thing to say whether or not the Biden decision to withdraw from Afghanistan back in April was smart or not. It's another to be faced with the scenes of a Taliban entering of Kabul without even the hint of opposition, of US forces and US diplomats and US citizens evacuating, even as the airport is overrun by thousands of desperate Afghans seeking to get out. And so the concern really is, the human rights situation in many of these countries, as you said, is challenged, but who is going to be the champion for them as we move forward? And what credibility do the traditional champions of democracy and human rights have? Without that, of course, South Asia's backsliding of democracy will probably continue unchecked.
And should we be concerned about these developments emboldening other militant groups operating in India and Pakistan, as well as throughout the rest of the region, to act more aggressively in asserting their influence and message?
Fabulous question, and really different answers depending on which country you're talking about. For India, not really. India has been dealing with armed insurgencies throughout its history, right? Obviously in Kashmir, in the northeast of India, the Naxal movement throughout the middle of India. But the Indian army is very, very professional. It's extremely well equipped and has shown a tremendous ability to be able to put down armed insurgencies before and to contain the ones that are currently outstanding. But Pakistan's a different question. The long Pakistani border with Afghanistan has long been difficult for the Pakistani army to control. It faces both the question of a resurgent, maybe emboldened Pakistan Taliban that sees now a refuge in Afghanistan. The Baloch separatist movement has always been a concern. Maybe that becomes emboldened and learns from Pakistan. And Pakistan's always had a different challenge exerting and projecting power into the provinces of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, or the frontier provinces that are closer to the north and west of that country's large geography. So I think for Pakistan, maybe that's a bigger concern, but for India, far less so.
Thank you, Irfan, for joining this episode of Fast Thinking. And for our viewers, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.